In this explainer, we're diving into the theory of contrastive analysis. We're going to look at how this field systematically compares languages to figure out the real challenges that learners face. When you're learning a new language, have you ever wondered why you make certain kinds of mistakes over and over? Why some grammar points just click while others feel, well, completely backwards? That is the exact question that the theory of contrastive analysis was designed to answer. So, first things first, we're going to define what contrastive analysis actually is and figure out where this kind of hybrid science fits into the bigger world of linguistics. Okay, that's the textbook definition. It sounds a bit dense, right? But at its core, contrastive analysis, or CA for short, is really just a method for systematically comparing two languages. The goal isn't to find out if they're related historically, but to create a specific map of their differences, to pinpoint exactly where they don't line up. You see, CA occupies this really unique space in linguistics. It's not a generalist theory trying to explain all language, but it's not a particularist study of just one language either. Its scope is always a pair of languages, and its focus is less on similarities and much more on the differences, making it a true hybrid approach. And this is where it gets really practical. The whole point of CA is to understand second language acquisition. It specifically zeroes in on what's called incipient individual bilingualism, which is a fancy way of saying it studies that messy in-between state a person is in while they're on the journey from knowing one language to knowing two. But to make these detailed comparisons, you need a powerful tool, right? An engine to drive the whole analysis. For comparative analysis, that engine is something called transformational generative grammar. Let's dig into how these mechanics actually work. So, transformational generative grammar, or TGG, says that every sentence has two levels. First, you've got the deep structure. This is the core universal meaning, the basic idea of who did what to whom. And then you have the surface structure, which is the final, grammatically correct sentence we actually speak or write. And that part is totally unique to each language. And this right here, this is the key that makes the whole thing possible. The universal base hypothesis argues that those deep structures are the same for everyone, for every language. This gives us a stable common ground, what linguists call a tertium comparatinus, that lets us objectively compare any two languages, no matter how different they seem on the surface. Let's see how this plays out. Take this simple English sentence, I have a red apple. The deep structure is really just two basic ideas. Then the grammar kicks in and applies a series of rules or transformations. First, it combines the ideas. Then it deletes the which is. And finally, it shifts the adjective to the front of the noun. Every step is a clear, specific rule. Now, if we do the same thing for the Arabic equivalent, you can see the deep structure, the basic meaning, is identical, but the rules are different. After the first two steps, the process is done. Arabic simply doesn't have that adjective shifting rule, so the adjective stays after the noun. This shows perfectly how two languages can start from the same universal idea but end up with very different sentences. Okay, so now that we have this model, we can really start to zero in on the exact grammatical points where languages diverge. Let's look at a few specific examples of TGG in action. One of the biggest points of contrast is how rules get applied. For example, in English, including the relative pronoun which is often optional. You can say the film I saw and it's perfectly fine. But in Arabic, the equivalent rule is obligatory. You have to include the pronoun adlithi. Leaving it out just doesn't work. Another key difference is what we call rule's scope. Think of it like how widely a rule is applied. In English, the rule to add a linking verb like is or are has a very broad scope. It applies in the present, past, and future. But in Arabic, that same rule has a much narrower scope. It applies for past or future, but for simple my brother is a student type sentences in the present, you don't use a verb at all. TLG can also give us these really elegant explanations for big patterns. Take a rule with a great name, Pied piping. This rule is all about whether a preposition has to move along with its pronoun. In English, we can leave it behind. We can say, what are you talking about? In Arabic, that's a no-go. The preposition has to follow the piper, so to speak. And this single rule helps explain differences in how both questions and relative clauses are formed. Now, TGG was a huge step, but it wasn't the final word. Linguists developed other models to try and refine contrastive analysis even more. Let's take a quick look at two of them, contrastive generative grammar and case grammar. The classical way of doing this, which we can call horizontal CAG, was a two-step process. First, you describe language A completely. Then you describe language B completely. Then you lay them side by side and compare. But contrastive generative grammar, or CGG, suggested a more integrated vertical approach. With this method, you generate the sentences for both languages at the same time, from that common base, comparing them at every single step of the process. This vertical process is pretty neat. It happens in 5 stages, almost like a sentence assembly line. It starts with a universal meaning. Then it makes language-specific choices about grammar categories and word order. After that, it plugs in the dictionary words. And finally, it applies all the little tweaks, like verb endings and plurals, to create the finished sentence. Then there's another model called case grammar. This one argues that the real universal deep structure isn't just abstract meaning, but a verb surrounded by nouns that all have a specific role in the action. Universal roles like the agent, the one doing the action, the objective, the thing being acted upon, or the instrumental, the tool being used. The theory is that these roles are how all humans fundamentally see the world. Okay, so after all these deep theoretical models, we have to ask a pretty fundamental question about contrastive analysis itself. Is this all just for pure science, or is it meant to be a practical tool? The thing is, the same method can serve 2 very different goals. A pure linguist might use CA to test big theories about human language in general, but an applied linguist uses the very same evidence to predict the exact errors a learner will make and to design better ways to teach them. So, what's the verdict? Well, the consensus is pretty clear. While CA can definitely contribute to theoretical discussions, its most powerful and significant contribution is in the real world of applied linguistics. At its heart, it's a tool for understanding and, hopefully, improving how we all learn languages. So I'll leave you with a question to chew on. If you accept this idea that there's a universal blueprint of meaning, a shared, deep structure that connects every single human language, how does that change the way you think about language, about learning, and even about how we communicate with each other?